Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum, where experts provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. On this episode of the AAF Exchange, what might it look like if this year's presidential candidates had anything close to an economic and fiscal policy agenda? Joining us to discuss all of this is AAF President Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Doug, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
How have you been? It's been an interesting couple of weeks here.
I've been loving it. I got a couple weeks vacation, and now I'm back in D.C. in August, where finding the pulse of the city is a daily task.
Yeah.
Like it's dead.
Yeah, it really. On my walk into work this morning, I don't think I was stopped. Even at the stoplights, I was able to get through rather quickly because, I walk and there was no cars on the road, so it was kind of, it's emblematic of what the city does in August.
I actually find August kind of boring, and historically I get real restless.
Yeah,
but the commute's way better.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. For sure. So before we get into today's topic, as always, we want to know what's on your mind. So give us something to spice our August up a little bit.
I continue to just be baffled and enraged by the one-year celebration of the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, I'm not a fan of the drug pricing provisions. That's well known. The clean energy thing, I think, is where it's been the fuzziest for me. I don't understand the celebration. We haven't accomplished anything on the climate change front. In 1 year you couldn't. So there's nothing really to celebrate there. You might think, okay, well, we built a lot of solar and wind farms, and isn't that great? But we have zero plan to connect them to the EVs and factories that we're supposedly powering with them. So that's not so great. And that raises the question, what are we getting for the money, right? I mean, the real issue in the end is, did we get more out of this investment than another investment, which we could have used the money on? Mm-hmm. And this is a lot of money. So they're celebrating spending $1 trillion. That's not the hardest thing to do in D.C.
Right.
You can get people to do that. So I just got to grit my teeth and move on.
Yeah, I mean, it was originally. I mean, a year ago, it was billed as this way to fight inflation. You noted at the time that it didn't.
Not a chance.
That wasn't going to hold water. Now, even the administration is admitting that that's not really what the purpose of it was. So, I mean, it just seems like this whole 1 year anniversary is trying to put it. Ryan. Figure out what this thing is.
In the end, it was the sort of tattered remnants of the famed Build Back Better agenda, which was enormous in scope and scale, and
put it with
the Senate and get 51 votes on. That's all there is to it, and it doesn't hang together because it really isn't a coherent plan.
Yeah. All right, let's jump into today's topic and talk about some of those policy issues that aren't getting the attention. Congress. So Congress is still on their August recess. They're home. The D.C. spotlight is certainly focused on the presidential campaign. I think candidates are on every other hour,
right,
or maybe every hour at this point. I don't really know. Talking about whatever their campaign message is that day. So Doug, for this episode, I want to get your take on how the candidates are doing on the policy front. For this campaign. So let's start with just your overall impressions before we get into specific issues.
Overall, this is a pretty much a policy-free campaign thus far. They're really a double standard by its nature. There's a sitting president who's going to be one candidate. So that policy agenda we talk about a lot. We're still trying to figure out the label Bidenomics, but so that gets a fair amount of attention. The Republican field has really not laid out an economic policy agenda. Sole exception is the speech that Ron DeSantis gave,
right,
where he talked about some of the things that he was interested in talking about. And it was sort of a funny mix of traditional small government conservative policies, low taxes, light regulation, concentrate the government on the things it does best, and sort of the new statism on the right. We're going to use the power of the state to fight ESG and wokeism and punish those companies that don't behave. So it's a funny mix of policy stances.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you've been through a campaign before. There was no incumbent when you were doing the 2008 campaign. So, I mean, is that normal at this point in the year that there's not a lot of policy out there? Do you foresee any coming?
Well, it's I think not unfair that they haven't laid out the specifics yet. They shouldn't be judged on that. What you usually get is some sort of broad sets of principles that they enunciate, and then sort of they fill in details as time goes on. So I think I'm waiting. I'm eager to see that. But at this point in time, I think there's some things we know pretty clearly. We just got downgraded by Fitch. Mm-hmm. That suggests that financial management, the fiscal policy outlook, is an important issue to this country. Yeah. And you can't talk about that unless you talk about what you're going to do with the 2017 tax bill and its sunset in 2025. If you want to extend all of it, it costs $3.5 trillion. So that's a fairly important price tag to have a plan for. Mm-hmm. You can't talk about the outlook if you don't talk about Medicare, Social Security, both of which are on track to run out of money. Something has to be done to make those programs sustainable. What's it going to be? No one's talking about any of those things. Yeah. That's the problem.
So that's a great setup for, I think, going through some of these issues and actually talking about it. So, okay, let's say you just accepted a role on one of these campaigns for the candidate of your choice as the chief policy advisor.
This is the first time in American history that a Doug is running for president, so you know where I'm going.
I mean, this brings up, I wasn't going to bring it up, but this brings up that Politico article about the group of the associations of Doug here in D.C. The Society of, I wasn't going to call it the Cult of Doug, but maybe it's the Society of Doug.
It's a secret society.
It was a great Politico article.
Great handshake, all the cool stuff.
Yeah, I still can't get over the fact that you did that article, that interview. Anyways, so you've become the senior policy advisor on one of these campaigns. We'll start with an easy policy issue, and that's of course the national debt. What would you advise as a platform here?
The threshold question is how are you going to get the debt to stop spiraling north, even relative to the economy? And so the pledge has to be, I will put in place a plan that will stabilize debt relative to GDP within 10 years and nose it downward, right? Because once you do that, the capital markets are going to be satisfied. You will have demonstrated that you can control the growth in the debt. You'll have set it on a trajectory to become smaller, not larger. There should be zero chance then of sort of downgrades, concerns about the U.S. Fiscal outlook. So that's the top line objective. To do that, you have to have a plan for Social Security, have a plan for Medicare. Those are the two programs that will grow faster than the economy, and they bleed red ink. And so the red ink grows faster than the economy. So you have to have a plan for those. And as I said, you then have to pay for all this stuff. So what are you going to do on the tax front?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you recall, but with all of that, yes, we have to tackle the Social Security and Medicare problem. But President Biden, in his State of the Union earlier this year, got in front of Congress and got them all to applaud, saying that Social Security and Medicare is off limits. So that seems to be pretty hard. How do you get Congress on board with this?
Right, and that scream you hear in the distance was me watching that. No, that to me is extraordinarily poor leadership. I mean, you cannot take those positions. You're misleading the American people. The beneficiaries need to know what the deal is. So if you're going to retire somewhere in the next 10 years, you don't know what your Social Security benefit is going to be. That's a real disservice. If you're a senior, you have to figure out, how am I going to think about my managing my healthcare expenses in retirement? Medicare's going to have to change. So, it's a disservice to the people to say we're not going to touch this. Mm-hmm. It needs to be touched.
Yeah.
And they need an assurance of what their benefits are going to look like. So I just can't support that. And I think every Republican should be saying, look, that's not what we need. What we need is some leadership to take care of this.
Yeah.
Now, that gets you into the tough stuff. What are you going to do? And take Social Security. Every bipartisan commission that's ever looked at the Social Security issue comes up with roughly the same plan. And the plan is raise some revenue, and usually they do that by raising the cap on payroll taxes back to its original 90% of wages get taxed. Now it's below 80. So you do that. That gets you more revenue. Then on the spending side, first thing you do is you raise the minimum benefit, which most people think is too small. But then you start shaving elsewhere, and you give less benefits to the lifetime affluence. You index it less for inflation in retirement. You index it accurately, and you slow the growth in benefits. The trouble with that plan is that A, you know who the winners and losers are very clearly. And it is, we're going to raise taxes on the people at the top end of the wage distribution, and we're going to cut their benefits. So we've just identified a whole set of losers.
Right.
And what happens in Congress is the losers show up to complain, and there will be myriad other tiny issues that show up, and it paralyzes the process. Social Security is such a simple system that you can't, there's no wiggle room.
Yeah.
And you have to take a stand and get it done.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's pretty much what every blue, like you said, every blue ribbon commission, insert players and people on that commission here, have said for the past 20 years or something like that. And and on top of that, there should be a sense of urgency that's not here. There's no leadership, the lack of leadership. Gordon does those chart books every couple of months, and I think the key takeaway, it's coming sooner than you think.
Yes.
The X date.
Yeah, and the point is, exhaustion isn't the only problem we have. If you just missed having the trust fund exhaust, that shouldn't be viewed as a victory. That's a narrow avoidance of disaster, but that's not a good thing.
Right.
A good thing would be to now put in place a plan that is durable, and people can make a plan on.
And just to make it a larger point, I think that was part of what Moody's was, Fitch was saying when they downgraded that. You have long-term debt issues,
and there's no plan.
You just almost went through a default on your loans. So
if you read the Fitch press release announcing the downgrade, they literally list as one of the critiques, there is no plan, with no in all caps. I mean, yes, that's a problem.
Yeah. All right. So we've talked, we talked about, the spending side of things, but with the revenue side of things as well. So let's move on to taxes. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act should be back in everybody's minds because, it will expire, I believe, in the next Congress, 2025.
Yeah.
What should candidates say about the importance of extending this law?
So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has some essentially components. One component was a set of reforms to taxation of our largest global companies, the big multinationals. Those have been, in my view, an enormous success, and it was a requirement of the Congress that they essentially pay for themselves. To get the thing through Congress, you can't have small businesses paying the tax bill for big businesses. That's how it usually falls apart. And so to avoid that food fight, they said, okay, the large corporation stuff has to stand on its own, with the sole exception of the rate cut, right? So they cut the rate. So what did we want to do with that? We wanted to make it better for capital to be invested in the U.S. compared to overseas, and we wanted the headquarters to be in the U.S., not overseas. Both of those things have been going wrong prior to 2017. Both of those things have dramatically improved. We have not lost a single headquarters since the law was enacted. There was one company that was leaving. Mm-hmm. They changed their mind, came back. So you can't question the success of those pieces of the law. So first thing is you say, we're keeping that stuff.
Right.
Don't talk about raising the rate back up to 28 and 35%, things like that. Bad idea. We want the companies here, we want the capital here, and that'll put the jobs here. Then you have the tougher thing. More than half of business income is taxed on individual returns as pass-through entities, sole proprietorships, partnerships, all that stuff. If you lower taxes on one kind of business, you want to lower taxes on the other kind so that there's a level playing field. Now you're cutting taxes for rich people because it's an individual reform. There's a lot of income reported there, and now you're cutting the taxes on it. That's where you run into the politics.
Right.
And that doesn't apply to your average guy who just has wage and salary income. What are you going to do for them? Well, are you really going to preserve the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act for the businesses of America and not for the families? That doesn't sound like a winning formula. So the solution to all of this is broaden the base. If you want those provisions, get more serious about broadening the base.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I mean, what if looking ahead a bit, it's hard to tell what the next Congress is going to look like until we've had the election. But does this get resolved, or are we looking at going back in your mind?
Well, I think there are really two paths, maybe three. But imagine that one party manages to control both the House and the Senate. Then, with reconciliation, you get what that party wants. Mm-hmm. So if it's Republicans, you can make it all permanent. but you couldn't, not permanent. You can extend it all, but in reconciliation, it's going to have to sunset again. So we just Groundhog Day. That's what we do. If it's the Democrats, they pitch some things and raise taxes on big companies, preserve the individual stuff. They can probably do that. It's a very different outcome. Or no one has control, and you have to come to some compromises. That probably ends up being short-term extensions because they can't really get to an agreement quickly. But the best outcome, the one I don't think is the highest probability, would be for them to make some compromise and permanently set the code so people knew what it was going to be.
Right. I mean, a little certainty never hurt anybody.
Yeah.
All right, let's do your favorite part of the podcast, trivia.
Yeah, 26. The answer is 26.
Yeah. I am. It should be something. It's on the Inflation Reduction Act again. So you're gonna get a third bite at the apple because you've done a dish on this.
That's good.
So, anyways, the Inflation Reduction Act contains a 15% minimum tax on something called book income.
Yes.
Such a tax is not a new idea. When was it first enacted, and how long did it last?
1986 and lasted till 1989.
Yeah, well, you got it right.
Yeah,
bells and whistles on that one.
A terrible idea that whose time has come again.
Yeah. So yeah, figure. I mean, it's this book income. What is this?
So when firms report their earnings, they're reporting their accounting earnings prepared according to GAAP standards. So it's their financial report income. It's an income that differs completely from taxable income. Taxable income is the cash flow in a particular year. A lot of book income is stuff you expect to get in future years. It gets booked in the year that you can anticipate it. So it's a mismatch on timing. Tax income has special deductions for things we care about, like it has special tax credits for clean energy investments, for example. Financial accounting doesn't do that. It just does a straight income take. So there are income measures designed for different purposes, and it's a bad idea to use financial income for tax purposes because, number one, it's really hard to do. Like they gave up on the first year of this tax because Treasury just couldn't figure out how to implement it, and they just sent out a notice that said we're going to try next year. Okay, so that's a real indictment.
Yeah,
and it's not going to be any better next year, I promise you. But the other thing it does is it gives you an incentive to misreport your income so your taxes are lower. That's the last thing you want.
Yeah,
you want financial reporting to be as clean as possible.
Right. I mean, so why now? Why is this back?
Because
did we just all forget how bad of an idea it was?
Yes, probably. The lesson's been lost. They were desperately looking for a way to get at big corporations, and they have this obsession with large corporations that have zero tax liability legally because they're doing the things Congress asked them to do, but they want to tax them anyway. So, it's not a good idea. If you want large corporations to pay taxes, don't let them be eligible for the deductions that they're taking. But then you're going to cut off a lot of investments that the Congress wants.
Mm-hmm. And all right, well, let's do our final topic, and it's one that we certainly talk about quite a bit. We at least talk about it every Monday, and that is regulations.
Yes.
President Biden just this week passed the $400 billion in regulatory costs mark, which nearly doubles what President Obama did. What his record was to this point in his term.
Right.
I mean, that's stunning. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, it's stunning, quite frankly. So for listeners who don't know this, there's every Monday the Week in Regulation comes out. Dan Goldbeck prepares it, and he keeps a running tab of the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations to comparable points in their tenure. And so, the Obama years were stunning, at least to me. 8 years, $890 billion of regulatory burden imposed on the private sector, $100 billion a year, stealth tax. I never thought we'd see that again. Trump, complete U-turn, real tight controls on regulation. Biden guys come in, they do $200 billion in the first year. And I think, wow. And because at that point, they haven't really gotten going on the climate stuff. I mean, the big ticket items are just starting to roll out.
Yeah.
So they have just vastly exceeded the Obama guys. The cost per regulation is nearly double again. And so they're doing a lot of regulation. It's very expensive. And at this point, it seems they're not thinking about the larger growth consequences. Those regulations are big cost shocks. They're the same as supply chain problems in the pandemic. And so we have these self-inflicted supply chain problems. They're going to raise costs. They're going to raise price pressures as a result at a time we're trying to go the other way. They're going to slow growth at a time when we'd like to have a better long-run trend growth. So it's hard for me to praise this sort of willy-nilly approach to regulation. I mean, there's no discipline to it.
Yeah.
And there's no apparent plan or check on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very striking that this is going on at the same time. They're out there trying to sell Bidenomics about growing the economy and making, getting through this inflationary period.
Well, remember, Bidenomics plank number one is smart investments, and to them that means choke the private sector, pump the money into their preferred projects. That's not my plan, but that's Bidenomics.
Yeah, speaking of your plan, let's resume your role as the senior campaign advisor on policy. What would you suggest presidential hopefuls propose for addressing the current regulatory environment?
I think the lesson of the Trump administration's really quite powerful. I didn't think they could accomplish what they did. So what they did was they put budgets on every agency. They said, you're allowed to raise regulatory costs by X. And to do that, if you have a new regulation, something has to go. And so it got labels like 1 in, 2 out, stuff like that. But the real issue was there's a budget. And you can't do whatever you want. You have to live within your budget.
Right.
Most of the budgets were zeros or negative numbers, which was, I thought, oh my, they'll never get that done. I mean, I'm a long-time swamp dweller, cynical, beaten, name it. They did it. And the real lesson was the agency staffs, the people, the bureaucrats, the people like to belittle, figured it out and said, okay, let's see how well we can do it. Became competitive. Which agency can have the best record on this? They know which regs are probably not working very well, so they started holding on to ones they needed. If they're going to have to pay for something, let's get rid of that one. Let's get rid of that one. And so that's the dynamic you want. You want them always looking to see what they can get rid of, and you want them competing to make sure the regs are cheap.
Yeah.
So do that at a minimum.
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember what the number was for Trump at this point, but I know it's significantly less. I mean, I think it's what?
It was a negative number this way. The first year he had a modest $15 billion in regs, which he then went negative for a couple of years. Then COVID hit.
Right.
And for his entire tenure, he's about at 40 to 50 billion, depending on how you do the math. It's a world apart from what we're in.
40 to 50 billion compared to
over
400 billion.
Yeah.
That's incredible because, do the math. What are we looking like? There's still time on this administration, and there's more regulations to come.
Yeah, if you extrapolate it, you're going to exceed the $1 trillion in regulatory costs.
That's stunning. That's really stunning.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's all I had to talk about, but Angela's not here, so I'm looking forward to sports.
We have to have a sports podcast at some point.
I really think Angela should let us.
But here's the thing. You'll talk about the Red Sox, the Patriots, and the Bruins, and nobody cares.
Listen, it's been...
So let's have a Doug talk on the Steelers and the Penguins and the Pirates.
I think we're leaving a lot of markets out, various markets across the country out with that kind of a conversation. I mean, the Boston faithful will be behind me, and I'm sure... whatever's left of
Steeler Nation travels. They're everywhere.
Yeah. your yellow towels and all of that. But I'm looking forward to football season.
Gold, Kyle. Gold.
Oh, gold. Excuse me. It's not yellow. But other than golf, I haven't had much to do on a Sunday, so I'm looking forward to being able to sit.
Could always be prepping the podcast.
Well, that's
Just saying.
I'm always prepping the podcast, so always looking for good bits to talk about in here. But I'm looking forward to it. I know you are. Thanks again for joining us for this podcast, and maybe one of these days we'll convince Angela to let us do that sports podcast. But I'm not going to hold my breath.
I doubt it.
Thanks again. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic issues. I'd also encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes, and also follow us on social media to learn more about AAF. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.